All right, hello Internet, hello YouTube. Today we will be page 166, the first line break on that page. We are in the subject-object chapter, I guess, section Precarious Balance. I'd say that we're probably halfway through. There are a lot of notes here, which I'm not going to read. So we'll be going to page 181. And I'll just start right now. For the artwork and thus for its theory, subject and object are its own proper elements, and they are dialectical in such a fashion that whatever the work is composed of, material, expression, and form, is always both. The materials are shaped by the hand from which the artwork received them. Expression, objectivated in the work and objective in itself, enters as a subjective impulse. Form, if it is not to have a mechanical relationship to what is formed, must be produced subjectively according to the demands of the object. What confronts artists with the kind of objective impenetrability with which their material so often confronts them, an impenetrability analogous to the construction of the given in epistemology, is at the same time sedimented subject, is expression, that which appears most subjective, but which is also objective in that it is what the artwork exhausts itself on and what it incorporates. Finally, it is a subjective comportment in which objectivity leaves its imprint. But the reciprocity of subject and object in the work, which cannot be that of identity, maintains a precarious balance. The subjective process of the work's production is, with regard to its private dimension, a matter of indifference. Yet the process also has an objective dimension that is a condition for the realization of its immanent lawfulness. It is as labor, and not as communication, that the subject in art comes into its own. It must be the artwork's ineluctable ambition to achieve balance without ever being quite able to do so. This is an aspect of aesthetic semblance. The individual artist also functions as the executor of this balance. It is hard to say whether, in the production process, he is faced with a self-imposed task. The marble block in which a sculpture waits, the piano keys in which a composition waits to be released, are probably more than metaphors for the task. The tasks bear their objective solution in themselves, at least within a certain variational range, though they do not have the univocity of equations. The act carried out by the artist is minimal, that of mediating between the problem that confronts him and is already determined, and the solution, which is itself similarly lodged in the material as a potential. If the tool has been called the extension of an arm, the artist could be called the extension of a tool for the transition from potentiality to actuality. Art's linguistic quality gives rise to reflection over what speaks in art. This is its veritable subject, not the individual who makes it or the one who receives it. This is masked by the lyrical eye, which in sing has over the centuries produced the semblance of the self-evidence of poetic subjectivity. But this subjectivity is on no account identical with the eye that speaks in the poem. This is not only because of the poetical fictional character of poetry and of music, in which subjective expression scarcely ever coincides immediately with the condition of the composer. Far more important is that the grammatical I of the poem is only posited by the I that speaks latently through the work. The empirical I is a function of the spiritual I, not the reverse. The part played by the empirical I is not, as the topos of sincerity would have it, the locus of authenticity. It remains undecided whether the latent I, the speaking I, is the same in the different genres of art and whether or not it changes. It may vary qualitatively according to the materials of the arts. The subsumption under the dubious subordinating concept of art obscures this. In any case, this latent I is immanently constituted in the work through the action of the work's language. In relation to the work, the individual who produces it is an element of reality like others. The private person is not even decisive in artworks. Implicitly, the artwork demands the division of labor, and the individual functions accordingly. By entrusting itself fully to its material, production results in something universal born out of the utmost individuation. The force with which the private I is externalized in the work is the I's collective essence. It constitutes the linguistic quality of works. The labor in the artwork becomes social by way of the individual, though the individual need not be conscious of society. Perhaps this is all the more true the less the individual is conscious of society. The intervening individual subject is scarcely more than a limiting value, something minimal required by the artwork for its crystallization. The emancipation of the artwork from the artist is no l'art pour l'art delusion of grandeur, but the simple expression of the work's constitution as the expression of a social relation that bears in itself the law of its own reification. Only as things do artworks become the antithesis of the reified monstrosity. Correspondingly, and this is key to art, even out of so-called individual works, it is a we that speaks and not an I. Indeed, all the more so the less the artwork adapts externally to a we and its idiom. Here again, music gives the most extreme expression to certain characteristics of the artistic, though this too by no means bestows any primacy on music. Music says we directly, regardless of its intentions. Even the depositional works of its expressionist phase register binding experiences, and the work's bindingness, their formative force, depends on whether these experiences actually speak through the works. In Western music, it would be possible to demonstrate how much its most important discovery, the harmonic depth dimension, as well as all counterpoint and polyphony, is the we of the choric ritual that has penetrated into the material. The we introduces its literalness transformed as any immanently acting force, and yet maintains the quality of speech. Literary forms, by their direct and ultimately inescapable participation in communicative language, are related to a we. For the sake of their own eloquence, they must strive to free themselves of all external communicativeness. But this process is not, as it appears to be, or seems to itself to be, one of pure subjectivization. Through this process, the subject forms itself to collective experience all the more intimately the more it hardens itself against linguistically reified expression. The plastic arts speak through the how of apperception. Their we is simply the sensorium according to its historical condition pursued to the point that it breaks the relation to representational objectivity that was modified by virtue of the development of its language of form. Images say, behold, they have their collective subject in what they point to, which is outward, not inward as with music. In the potentiation of its linguistic quality, the history of art, which is equivalent to that of progressive individualization, is at the same time its opposite. That this we is, however, not socially univocal, that it is hardly that of a determinate class or social positions, has its origin perhaps in the fact that to this day art, in the emphatic sense, has only existed as bourgeois art. According to Trotsky's thesis, no proletarian art is conceivable, only socialist art. The aesthetic we is a social whole on the horizon of a certain indeterminateness, though granted as determinate as the ruling productive forces and relations of an epoch. Although art is tempted to anticipate a non-existent social whole, is non-existent subject, and is thereby more than ideology, it bears at the same time the mark of this subject's non-existence. The antagonisms of society are nevertheless preserved in it. Art is true insofar as what speaks out of it, indeed, it itself, is conflicting and unreconciled, but this truth only becomes art's own when it synthesizes what is fractured and thus makes its irreconcilability determinate. Paradoxically, art must testify to the unreconciled and at the same time envision its reconciliation. This is a possibility only for its non-discursive language. Only in this process is its we concretized. What speaks out of it, however, is truly its subject insofar as it indeed speaks out of it rather than being something depicted by it. The title of the incomparable final piece of Schumann's Scenes from Childhood, The Poet Speaks, one of the earliest models of expressionist music, takes cognizance of this. But the aesthetic subject is probably unrepresentable because, being socially mediated, it is no more empirical than the transcendental subject of philosophy. The objectivation of the artwork takes place at the cost of the replication of the living. Artworks win life only when they renounce likeness to the human. The expression of an unadulterated feeling is always banal. The more unadulterated, the more banal. Not to be banal requires effort. End quote. The artwork becomes objective as something made through and through, that is, by virtue of the subjective mediation of all its elements. The insight of the critique of knowledge that subjectivity and reification are correlative receives unparalleled confirmation in aesthetics. The semblance character of artworks, the illusion of their being in itself, refers back to the fact that in the totality of their subjective mediatedness, they take part in the universal delusional context of reification, and that in Marxian terms, they need to reflect a relation of living labor as if it were a thing. The inner consistency through which artworks participate in truth also involves their untruth. In its most unguarded manifestations, art has always revolted against this. Today, this revolt has become art's own law of movement. The antinomy of the truth and untruth of art may have moved Hegel to foretell its end. Traditional aesthetics possess the insight that the primacy of the whole over the parts has constitutive need of the diverse, and that this primacy misfires when it is simply imposed from above. No less constitutive, however, is that no artwork has ever been fully adequate in this regard. Granted, the multiplicitous in the aesthetic continuum wants synthesis, yet at the same time, being determined extra-aesthetically, it withdraws from synthesis. The synthesis that is extrapolated out of multiplicity, which it has as a potential in itself, is unavoidably also the negation of this multiplicity. The equilibrium sought by form must misfire internally because externally, meta-aesthetically, it does not exist. Antagonisms that are unsolved in reality cannot be solved imaginatively either. They work their way into the imagination and are reproduced in imagination's own inconsistency. In fact, this happens in proportion to the intensity with which they pursue their coherence. Artworks must act as if the impossible were for them possible. The idea of the perfection of works, with which none can dispense except at the cost of its own triviality, was dubious. Artworks have a hard fate not only because of their always uncertain fate in the world, but because through their own efforts they necessarily work against the aesthetic truth to which they devote themselves. Inasmuch as subject and object have become disjoint in historical reality, art is possible only in that it passed through the subject. For mimesis of what is not administered by the subject has no other locus than in the living subject. The objectivation of art through its imminent execution requires the historical subject. If the artwork hopes through its objectivation to achieve that truth that is hidden from the subject, then This is so because the subject is itself not ultimate. The relation of the objectivity of the artwork to the primacy of the object is fractured. This objectivity bears witness to the primacy of the object in a condition of universal thraldom that only in the subject provides a place of refuge for what is in itself, while at the same time the form of the objectivity of this in itself, which is a semblance effected by the subject, is a critique of objectivity. This objectivity grants entry exclusively to the membra disjecta of the world of objects, which only in a state of decomposition becomes commensurable to the law of form. Subjectivity, however, though a necessary condition of the artwork, is not the aesthetic quality as such, but becomes it only through objectivation. To this extent, subjectivity in the artwork is self-alienated and concealed. This is not comprehended by Riegel's concept of artistic volition. Yet this concept discerns an element essential to immanent critique, that nothing external adjudicates over the niveau of artworks. They, not their authors, are their own measure. In Wagner's words, their self-posited law. The question of their own legitimation is not lodged beyond their fulfillment. No artwork is only what it aspires to be, but there is none that is more than this without aspiring to be something. This bears closely on spontaneity, although precisely it also involves the non-volitional. Spontaneity manifests itself primarily to the conception of the work, through the design evident in it. But conception, too, is no ultimate category. It often transforms the self-realization of the artworks. It is virtually the seal of objectivation that, under the pressure of its immanent logic, the conception is displaced. This self-alien element that works contrary to the purported artistic volition is familiar, sometimes terrifyingly so, to artists as to critics. Nietzsche broached this issue at the end of Beyond Good and Evil. The element of self-alienness that occurs under the constraint of the material is indeed the seal of what was meant by genius. If anything is to be salvaged of this concept, it must be stripped away from its crude equation with the creative subject, who through vain exuberance bewitches the artwork into a document of its maker and thus diminishes it. The objectivity of artworks, a thorn in the side of the inhabitants of a society based on barter because they mistakenly expect that art will mollify the alienation, is translated back into the person who stands behind the work, even though he is usually only the character mask of those who want to promote the work as an article of consumption. If one does not simply want to abolish the concept of genius as a romantic residue, it must be understood in terms of its historico-philosophical objectivity, the divergence of subject and individual, adumbrated in Kant's anti-psychologism and raised to the level of a principle in Fichte, takes its toll on art too. Art's authenticity, what is binding in it, and the freedom of the emancipated individual become remote from each other. The concept of genius represents the attempt to unite the two with a wave of the wand, to bestow the individual within the limited sphere of art with the immediate power of overarching authenticity. The experiential content of such mystification is that in art authenticity, the universal element, is no longer possible except by way of the principium individuatonis, just as conversely, universal bourgeois freedom is exclusively that of particularization and individuation. This relation, however, is treated blindly by the aesthetics of genius and displaced undialectically into an individual who is supposedly at the same time subject, the intellectus archetypus, which in the theory of knowledge is expressly the idea, is traded by the concept of genius as a fact of art. Genius is purported to be the individual whose spontaneity coincides with the action of the absolute subject. This is correct insofar as the individuation of artworks, mediated by spontaneity, is that in them by which they are objectivated. Yet the concept of genius is false because works are not creations and humans are not creators. This defines the untruth of any genius aesthetics that suppresses the element of finite making, the Greek word in artworks, in favor of their absolute originality, virtually their natura naturans. It thus spawns the ideology of the organic and unconscious artwork, which flows into the murky current of irrationalism. From the start, the genius aesthetic shifted emphasis toward the individual, opposing a spurious universality and away from society by absolutizing this individual. Yet whatever the misuse perpetrated by the concept of genius, it calls to mind that the subject in the artwork should not be reduced to its objectivation. In the critique of judgment, the concept of genius became the refuge for everything of which hedonism had deprived Kant's aesthetics. However, with incalculable consequences, Kant restricted geniality exclusively to the subject, indifferent to its ego-alienness, which was later ideologically exploited by contrasting genius with scientific and philosophical rationality. The fetishization of the concept of genius that begins with Kant as the fetishization of directed abstract subjectivity, to put it in Hegelian terms, already in Schiller's votive offerings took on a quality of crass elitism. The concept of genius becomes the potential enemy of artworks. With a sidelong glance at Goethe, the person back of the work is purported to be more essential than the artworks themselves. In the concept of genius, the idea of creation is transferred with idealistic hubris from the transcendental to the empirical subject, to the productive artist. This suits crude bourgeois consciousness as much because it implies a work ethic that glorifies pure human creativity regardless of its aim, as because the viewer is relieved of taking any trouble with the object itself. The viewer is supposed to be satisfied with the personality, essentially a kitsch biography of the artist. Those who produce important artworks are not demigods but fallible, often neurotic and damaged individuals. An aesthetic mentality, however, that wholly swept away the idea of genius would degenerate into a desolate, pedantic arts and crafts mentality devoted to tracing out stencils. The element of truth in the concept of genius is to be sought in the object, in what is open, not in the repetition of the imprisoned. Incidentally, the concept of genius as it came in vogue in the late 18th century was in no way charismatic. In that epoch, any individual could become a genius to the extent that he expressed himself unconventionally as nature. Genius was an attitude to reality, ingenious doings, indeed almost a conviction or frame of mind. Only later, perhaps given the insufficiency of mere conviction in artworks, did genius become a divine blessing. The experience of real unfreedom destroyed the exuberance of subjective freedom as freedom for all and reserved it as the exclusive domain of genius. It becomes ideology in inverse proportion to the world's becoming a less human, and the more consciousness of this spirit is neutralized. To a less human one, and the more consciousness of this spirit is neutralized. Privileged genius becomes the proxy to whom reality promises but it denies humanity as a whole. What deserves to be salvaged in genius is what is instrumental to the work. The category of geniality can best be documented when a passage is described as being ingenious. Fantasy alone does not suffice for its definition. The genial is a dialectical knot. It is what has been copied or repeated. It is free, yet at the same time bears the feeling of necessity. It is art's paradoxical sleight of hand and one of its most dependable criteria. To be genial means to hit upon a constellation, subjectively to achieve the objective. It is the instant in which the methexis of the artwork in language allows convention to be discarded as accidental. The signature of the genial in art is that the new appears by virtue of its newness, as if it had always been there. Romanticism took note of this. The work of fantasy is less creatio ex nihilo, the belief of an art-alien religion of art, than the imagining of authentic solutions in the midst of the effectively pre-existing nexus of works. Experienced artists may be overheard referring derisively to a passage, "Here he's a genius." They chastise the intrusion of fantasy into the logic of the work, an intrusion not subsequently integrated. Instances of this are found not only in the work of self-promoting whiz kids, but even at Schubert's niveau. The genial remains paradoxical and precarious because the freely discovered and the necessary cannot actually ever be completely fused. Without the ever-present possibility of failure, there is nothing genial in artworks. Because of its element of something that had not existed before, the genial was bound up with the concept of originality, thus the concept original génie, as is well known. Prior to the age of genius, the idea of originality bore no authority. That in their new works, composers of the 17th and early 18th centuries made use of whole sections of their own earlier works and those of others, or that painters and architects entrusted their designs to students for completion, is easily misused to justify the stereotypical and routine and to denounce subjective freedom. Yet what this practice demonstrates is that originality had yet to become the object of critical reflection, by no means that there was no originality in artworks. One glance at the difference between Bach and his contemporaries suffices to make the point. Originality, the specificity of a determinate artwork, is not antithetical to the logicality of artworks, which implies a universal. Often originality emerges from a thoroughly consistent logical construction, of which mediocre talents are incapable. All the same, the question of the originality of older, archaic works is meaningless because the coercion exercised by collective consciousness, in which domination entrenches itself, was so extensive that originality, which presupposes something on the order of emancipated subjectivity, would be anachronistic. The concept of originality, as in Benjamin's sense of the originary, does not so much summon up the primordial as the yet-to-be in works, their utopic trace. The original is the objective name of each work. If, however, originality arose historically, it is also enmeshed in historical injustice, in the predominance of bourgeois commodities that must touch up the ever-same as the ever-new in order to win customers. Yet with the growing autonomy of art, originality has turned against the market where it was never permitted to go beyond a certain limit. It withdrew into the artworks themselves, into the relentlessness of their integral organization. Originality remains touched by the historical fate of the category of the individualness from which it was derived. Originality no longer obeys what it has been associated with ever since it began to be self-consciously reflected upon, a so-called individual style. Although the collapse of that style has meanwhile come to be decried by traditionalists who are in fact defending conventional goods, in the most progressive works, individual style, cunningly tricked out of the requirements of construction, takes on the quality of a blemish, a deficiency, or at least a compromise. This is one of the most important reasons why advanced artistic production aims less at originality in a particular work than at the production of a new type. Originality is in the process of being transformed into the act of inventing types, a transformation in which originality is changed qualitatively without, however, disappearing in the process. This transformation, which altogether severs originality from mere inspiration, the unique detail that once seemed to be the substance of originality, throws light on fantasy, its organon. Under the spell of the belief in the subject as the creator's successor, fantasy effectively meant the capacity to bring forth something determinately artistic out of nothing. Its crude concept, that of absolute invention, is the exact correlate of the modern scientific ideal of the strict reproduction of what already exists. Here the bourgeois division of labor has furrowed a trench that divides art from any mediation with reality, just as it divides knowledge from everything that in any way transcends reality. This concept of fantasy was never essential to important artworks. The invention, for instance, of fantastic beings in contemporary plastic arts is of minor significance, just as the sudden intervention of a musical motif, though hardly to be discounted, remains powerless so long as it does not surpass its own factuality through what develops out of it. If everything in artworks, including what is most sublime, is bound up with what exists, which they oppose, fantasy cannot be the mere capacity to escape the existing by positing the non-existing as if it existed. On the contrary, fantasy shifts whatever artworks absorb of the existing into constellations through which they become the other of the existing, if only through its determinate negation. If the effort is made to envision a strictly non-existing object through what epistemologists dubbed fantasizing fiction, nothing is achieved that cannot be reduced, in its parts and even in the elements that constitute its coherence, to what already exists. Only under the spell of the totally empirical does what is qualitatively opposed to it appear, though it does so exclusively as something on the second order of existence modeled on the first. Art transcends the non-existing only by way of the existing, otherwise it becomes the helpless projection of what in any case already exists. Accordingly, fantasy in artworks cannot be restricted to the sudden vision. Although there is no conceiving of fantasy devoid of spontaneity, fantasy, despite being closest to the creatio ex nihilo, is by no means art's one and all. Fantasy may be set in motion primarily by something concrete in the artwork, especially among those artists whose process of production works upward from below. Equally, however, fantasy is active in a dimension that a common prejudice holds to be abstract, namely in the dimension of the quasi-empty outline, which is then fleshed out and made good on through what prejudice considers the opposite of fantasy, labor. Even specifically technological fantasy is not a recent development, as is evident in the compositional style of the Adagio of Schubert's string quintet, as well as in the eddies of light in Turner's seascapes. Fantasy is also, and essentially so, the unrestricted availability of potential solutions that crystallize within the artwork. It is lodged not only in what strikes one both as existing and as the residue of something existing, but perhaps even more in the transformation of the existing. The harmonic variant of the main theme in the coda of the first movement of the Appassionata, with the catastrophic effect of the diminished seventh chord, is no less a product of fantasy than in the triadic theme of the brooding idea that opens the movement. With regard to Genesis, it cannot be excluded that the variant that is decisive for the whole might in fact have been Beethoven's initial idea, from which, retroactively as it were, the theme in its primary form was derived. It is no less of an achievement of fantasy that the later sections of the broadly cast development of the first movement of the Eroica give way to lapidary harmonic periods, as if suddenly there was no time for differentiation. The growing primacy of construction necessarily reduced the substantiality of the particular inspiration. Just how much labor and fantasy are implicated in each other, their divergence is invariably an index of failure, is supported by the experience of artists that fantasy is subject to command. They sense that the freedom to the involuntary is what distinguishes them from dilettantes. Even subjectively, the mediate and the immediate are in turn mediated in each other aesthetically and in knowledge. Not genetically, but in terms of its constitution, art is the most compelling argument against the epistemological division of sensuality and intellect. Reflection is fully capable of the act of fantasy in the form of the determinate consciousness of what an artwork at a certain point needs. The idea that consciousness kills, for which art supposedly provides unimpeachable testimony, is a foolish cliché in this context as anywhere else. Even its power to resolve objects into their components, its critical element, is fruitful for the self-reflection of the artwork. It excludes and modifies the inadequate, the unformed, and the incoherent. On the other hand, the category of aesthetic dumbness has its fundamentum in re as the lack of immanent reflection in works, which is evident, for instance, in the stupor of mechanical repetition. What is bad in artworks is a reflection that directs them externally, that forces them, Where, however, they imminently want to go can only be followed by reflection, and the ability to do this is spontaneous. If each and every artwork involves a probably aporetic nexus of problems, this is the source of what is perhaps not the worst definition of fantasy. As the capacity to discover approaches and solutions in the artwork, fantasy may be defined as the differential of freedom in the midst of determination. Hilarious. The objectivity of artworks is no more a residual determination than is any truth. Neoclassicism faltered because it deluded itself with the goal of achieving an ideal of objectivity, which appeared to it in apparently binding styles of the past, by way of a subjectively instituted procedure. It abstractly negated the subject in the work and formulated the imago of a subjectless in itself, which the subject, itself no longer eliminable by any act of will, could throw into relief solely by means of injury to itself. A rigor that establishes restrictions by imitating long past heteronymous forms obeys nothing other than that very subjective volition that is to be tamed. Valéry outlined the problem but did not solve it. The form that is merely chosen and posited, which Valéry himself sometimes defends, is as accidental as a chaotic vitality he despised. The aporia of art today is not to be cured through any willing subordination to authority. It remains an open question just how, without coercion, it would be possible, given an unmitigated nominalism, to achieve anything on the order of an objectivity of form. This is impeded by instituted closure. The tendency toward this instituted closure was synchronous with the rise of political fascism, whose ideology similarly feigned that a state freed from the desperation and insecurity of its subjects during the period of late liberalism could be hoped for only on the basis of the abdication of the subject. Of course, this abdication was prompted by more powerful subjects. Even in its fallibility and weakness, the subject who contemplates art is not expected simply to retreat from the claim to objectivity. Otherwise, it would hold that those alien to art, the Philistines devoid of any relation to art, who let it affect them as if they were a tabula rasa, would be the most qualified to understand and judge it, and the unmusical would be the best music critics. Like art itself, knowledge of it is consummated dialectically. The more the observer adds to the process, the greater the energy with which he penetrates the artwork, the more he then becomes aware of objectivity from within. He takes part in objectivity when his energy, even that of his misguided subjective projection, extinguishes itself in the artwork. The subjective detour may totally miss the mark, but without the detour, no objectivity becomes evident. Every step toward the perfection of artworks is a step toward their self-alienation, and this dialectically produces ever anew those revolts that are too superficially characterized as subjectivity's rebellion against formalism of whatever sort. The growing integration of artworks, their imminent exigency, is also their imminent contradiction. The artworks that carries through its imminent dialectic reflects it as resolves. This is what is aesthetically false in the aesthetic principle. The antinomy of aesthetic reification is also one between the ever-fractured metaphysical claim of works to being exempted from time and the transience of everything that establishes itself in time as enduring. Artworks become relative because they must assert themselves as absolute. Benjamin touched on this once in commenting that there is no redemption for artworks. The perennial revolt of art against art has its fundamentum in re. If it is essential to artworks that they be things, it is no less essential that they negate their own status as things, and thus art turns against art. The totally objectivated artwork would congeal into a mere thing, whereas If it altogether evaded objectivation, it would regress to an impotently powerless subjective impulse and flounder in the empirical world. Interesting. Very, very interesting. I wonder what this has to say about this new, relatively new trend in art history, art historical methodology of material cultures. That the experience of artworks is adequate only as living experience is more than a statement about the relation of the observer to the observed, more than a statement about psychological cathexis as a condition of aesthetic perception. Aesthetic experience becomes living experience only by way of its object. In that instance in which artworks themselves become animate under its gaze. This is Georges' symbolist teaching in the poem The Tapestry, an art poetique that furnishes the title of a volume. Through contemplative immersion, the immanent processual quality of the work is set free. By speaking, it becomes something that moves in itself. Whatever in the artifact may be called the unity of its meaning is not static but processual, the enactment of antagonisms that each work necessarily has in itself. Analysis is therefore adequate to the work only if it grasps the relation of its elements to each other processually, rather than reducing them analytically to purported fundamental elements. That artworks are not being, but a process of becoming can be grasped technologically. The continuity is demanded teleologically by the particular elements. They are in need of continuity and capable of it by virtue of their incompleteness and, often, by their insignificance. It is as a result of their own constitution that they go over into their other, find continuance in it, want to be extinguished in it, and in their demise determine what follows them. This immanent dynamic is, in a sense, a higher order element of what artworks are. If anywhere, then it is here that aesthetic experience resembles sexual experience, indeed its culmination. The way the beloved image is transformed in this experience, the way rigidification is unified with what is most intensely alive, effectively makes the experience the incarnate prototype of aesthetic experience. Yet it is not only the individual works that are immanently dynamic, so too is the relation to each other. Art is historical exclusively by way of individual works that have taken shape in themselves, not by their external association, not even through the influence that they purportedly exert over each other. This is why art mocks verbal definition. That whereby art's existence is constituted is itself dynamic as an attitude toward objectivity that both withdraws from and takes up a stance toward it, and in this stance maintains objectivity transformed. Artworks synthesize ununifiable, non-identical elements that grind away at each other. They truly seek the identity of the identical and the non-identical processually because even their unity is only an element and not the magical formula of the whole. The processual quality of artworks is constituted in such a fashion that as artifacts, as something humanly made, they have their place a priori in their native realm of spirit, but are, in order to become self-identical, in need of what is non-identical, heterogeneous, and not already formed. The resistance to them of otherness, on which they are nevertheless dependent, compels them to articulate their own formal language, to leave not the smallest unformed particle as remnant. This reciprocity constitutes art's dynamic. It is an irresolvable antithesis that is never brought to rest in the state of being. Artworks are such only in actua because their tension does not terminate in pure identity with either extreme. On the other hand, it is only as finished, molded objects that they become force fields of their antagonism. Otherwise, the encapsulated forces would simply run parallel to each other or dissipate. Artwork's paradoxical nature, stasis, negates itself. The movement of artworks must be at a standstill and thereby become visible. Their imminent processual character, the legal process that they undertake against the merely existing world that is external to them, is objective prior to their alliance with any party. All artworks, even the affirmative, are a priori polemical. The idea of a conservative artwork is inherently absurd. By emphatically separating themselves from the empirical world, their other, they bear witness that that world itself should be other than it is. They are the unconscious schemata of that world's transformation. Even for an artist like Mozart, he seems so unpolemical and who, according to general agreement, moves solely within the pure sphere of spirit, accepting the literary themes that he chose for his greatest operas. The polemical element is central in the power by which the music sets itself at a distance that mutely condemns the impoverishment and falsity of that from which it distances itself. In Mozart, form acquires the power of that distancing as determinate negation. The reconciliation that it realizes is painfully sweet because reality to date has refused it. The resoluteness of distance is presumably that of all classicism that is forceful rather than vacantly playing with itself, concretizes the critique of what has been repulsed. What crackles in artworks is the sound of the friction of the antagonistic elements that the artwork seeks to unify. It is script not least because, as in linguistic signs, its processual element is enciphered in its objectivation. The processual character of artworks is nothing other than their temporal nucleus. If duration becomes their intention in such a fashion that they expel what they deem ephemeral, and by their own hand eternalize themselves in pure impregnable forms, or worse, by the ominous claim to be to the universally human, they cut short their lives and assimilate themselves into the concept that, as the fixed circumference of shifting contents, by its form pursues precisely that temporal stasis against which the drawn tension of the artwork defends itself. Artworks, mortal human objects, pass away all the more rapidly the more doggedly they stave it off. Although permanence cannot be excluded from the concept of their form, it is not their essence. Daringly exposed works that seem to be rushing toward their perdition have in general a better chance of survival than those that, subservient to the idol of security, hollow out their temporal nucleus and, inwardly vacuous, fall victim to time, the curse of neoclassicism. Speculating on survival by adding something perishable is hardly helpful. Today it is conceivable and perhaps requisite that artworks immolate themselves through their temporal nucleus, devote their own life to the instant of the appearance of truth, and tracelessly vanish without thereby diminishing themselves in the slightest. The nobility of such comportment would not be unworthy of art now that its loftiness has decayed to attitude and ideology. The idea of the permanence of works is modeled on the category of property and is thus ephemeral in the bourgeois sense. It was alien to many periods and important productions. It is said that when Beethoven finished the Appassionata, he commented that it would still be played 10 years later. Stockhausen's concept of electronic works, which, since they are not notated in the traditional sense but immediately realized in their material, could be extinguished along with this material, is a splendid one of an art that makes emphatic claim yet is prepared to throw itself away. Like other constituents through which art once became what it is, even its temporal nucleus has been exteriorized and explodes its concept. The common declarations against fashion that equate the transient with the nugatory are not only allied with the counter-image of an inwardness that has been compromised politically as well as aesthetically by its incapacity for exteriorization and a stubborn limitation to individual quiddity. In spite of its commercial manipulability, fashion reaches deep into artworks. It does not simply exploit them. Such inventions as Picasso's Rayonism are like transpositions from haute couture experiments, pinning dresses together around the body for an evening rather than tailoring them in a traditional manner. Fashion is one of the ways in which historical movement affects the sensorium, and through it, artworks, and this is so usually by way of minimal self-obtuse impulses. The artwork is a process essentially in the relation of its whole and parts. Without being reducible to one side or the other, it is the relation itself that is a process of becoming. Whatever may in the artwork be called totality is not a structure that integrates the sum of its parts. Even objectified, the work remains a developing process by virtue of the propensities active in it. Conversely, the parts are not something given, as which analysis almost inevitably mistakes them. Rather, they are centers of energy that strain toward the whole on the basis of a necessity that they equally preform. The vortex of this dialectic ultimately consumes the concept of meaning, when according to history's verdict, the unity of process and results no longer succeeds, when, above all, the individual elements refuse to mold themselves to the ever latently preconceived totality, the gaping divergence tears meaning apart. If the artwork is nothing fixed and definitive in itself, but something in motion, then its immanent temporality is communicated to its parts in a whole in such a fashion that the relation develops in time, that they're capable of canceling this relation. If artworks are alive in history by virtue of their own processual character, they are also able to perish in it. The indefeasibility of what is sketched on paper, painted on canvas, or carved in stone is no guarantee of the indefeasibility of what is essential to the artwork, its spirit, which is dynamic in itself. Artworks are on no account transformed exclusively by what reified consciousness takes to be the changing attitude of individuals toward works, which shifts according to the historical situation. Such change is external with regard to what transpires in the works themselves, the dissolution of their layers, one after the other, which is unforeseeable in the moment of the work's appearance, the determination of this transformation by the emerging and increasingly distinct law of form, the petrification of works that have become transparent, their decrepitude, and their falling silent. Ultimately, their development is the same as their process of collapse. The concept of an artifact, from which artwork is etymologically derived, does not fully compromise what an artwork is. Knowing that an artwork is something made does not amount to knowing that it is an artwork. The exaggerated accent on its fabrication, whether to lambast art as human deception or to denounce its artificiality or preciousness in opposition to the delusion of art as unmediated nature, stands in sympathetic accord with Philistinism. The idea of providing a simple definition of art was dared only by those all-disposing philosophical systems that reserved a niche for every phenomenon. Hegel did indeed define beauty, but not art, presumably because he recognized its unity with and difference from nature. In art, the difference between the thing made and its genesis, the making, is emphatic. Artworks are something made that has become more than something simply made. This was not contested until art began to experience itself as transient, the confounding of artworks with their genesis, as if genesis provided the universal code for what has become, is the source of the alienness of art scholarship to art. For artworks obey their law of form by consuming their genesis. Specifically, aesthetic experience, self-abandonment to artworks, is indifferent to their genesis. Knowledge of the genesis is as external to aesthetic experience as is the history of the dedication of the eroica to what musically transpires in that symphony. The attitude of authentic artworks toward extra-aesthetic objectivity is not so much to be sought in how this objectivity affects the process of production. for the artwork is in itself a comportment that reacts to that objectivity even while turning away from it. Germane here is Kant's discussion of the real and the imitated Nightingale and critique of judgment, the theme of Andersen's famous fairy tale that has so often been turned into opera. Kant's reflection on it substitutes the knowledge to be discerned. This would cancel any interest in the question of the authenticity or non-authenticity of the phenomenon, though it would be necessary to concede to Kant that such knowledge colors aesthetic experience. One sees a painting differently if one knows the name of the painter. No art is presuppositionless, and its presuppositions can no more be eliminated than art could be deduced from them. Rather than the Kantian artificer, Andersen, with good instinct, dealt with a toy. Stravinsky's opera characterizes the sound of that toy as a mechanical piping. The difference from a natural song is perceptible in the phenomenon. As soon as the artifact wants to prompt the illusion of the natural, it founders. The artwork is both the result of the process and the process itself at a standstill. It is what, at its apogee, rationalist metaphysics proclaimed as the principle of the universe, a monad, at once a force field and a thing. Artworks are closed to one another, blind, and yet in their hermeticism they represent what is external. Thus it is, in any case, that they present themselves to tradition as that living autarky that Goethe was fond of calling entelechy, the synonym for monad. It is possible that the more problematic the concept of teleology becomes in organic nature, the more intensively it condensed itself in artworks. As an element of an overarching context of the spirit of an epoch, entwined with history and society, artworks go beyond their monadic limit even though they lack windows. The interpretation of an artwork as an imminent crystallized process at a standstill approximates the concept of the monad. The thesis of the monadological character of artworks is as true as it is problematic. Their stringency and internal structuration are borrowed from their intellectual domination of reality. To this extent, what is transcendent to them is imported into them as that by which they are in the first place become an immanent nexus. These categories are, however, so completely modified that only the shadow of bindingness remains. Irrevocably, aesthetics presupposes immersion in the particular work. There is no denying the progress made even in academic art scholarship through the demand for immanent analysis and the renunciation of methods concerned with everything but the artwork. At the same time, however, immanent analysis bears an aspect of self-deception. There is no determination of the particularity of an artwork that does not, as a universal, according to its form, go beyond the monad. It is delusive to claim the concept, which must be introduced externally to the monad in order to open it up from within and thus to shatter it, has its source exclusively in the object. The monadological constitution of artworks is in themselves points beyond itself. It is made absolute. Immanent analysis falls prey to ideology, against which it struggled when it wanted to devote itself to the artworks internally rather than deducing their worldviews. Today, it is already evident that immanent analysis, which was once a weapon of artistic experience against Philistinism, is being misused as a slogan to hold social reflection at a distance from an absolutized art. Without social reflection, however, the artwork is not to be understood in relation to that of which it constitutes one element, nor is it to be deciphered in terms of its own content. The blindness of the artwork is not only a corrective of the nature-dominating universal, it is also its correlative. As always, the blind and the empty belong together in their abstractness. No particular in the artwork is legitimate without also becoming universal through its particularization. True, as an investigative procedure, subsumption never reveals aesthetic content, but if subsumption is rejected altogether, no content would be thinkable. Aesthetics would have to capitulate in front of the artwork as before a factum brutum. The aesthetically determined particular is to be referred to the element of its universality exclusively by way of its monadological closure. With a regularity that is indicative of something structural, immanent analyses, if their contact with what has been formed is close enough, lead to universal determinations that emerge directly from the most extreme specification. Certainly, this is also due to the analytical method. Explanation amounts to the reduction to what is already known, whose synthesis with what is to be explained inescapably involves a universal. But the reversal of the particular into the universal is no less determined by the individual object. What it is concentrated, where it is concentrated in itself to an extreme, it executes tensions that originate in the genre. Examples here are Anton Webern's artworks, in which somata movements shrink to aphorisms. Aesthetics is not obliged, as under the spell of its object, to exercise concepts. Rather, its responsibility is to free concepts from the externality to the particular object and to bring them within the work. If anywhere, then, it is in aesthetics that Hegel's formulation of the movement of the concept has its locus. The reciprocal relation of the universal and the particular, which takes place unconsciously in artworks and which aesthetics must bring to consciousness, is what truly necessitates a dialectical approach. It could be objected that a residual dogmatic trust is operative here. External to the Hegelian system, it could be claimed, the movement of the concept has no sphere of legitimacy. The object can only be grasped as the life of the concept if the totality of what is objective coincides with spirit. To that the reply is that the monads, which artworks are, lead by way of their own principle of particularization to the universal. The universal determinations of art are not simply an exigency of their conceptual reflection. They testify to the boundaries of the principle of individuation, which is no more to be ontologized than is its opposite. Artworks get ever closer to these boundaries the more uncompromisingly they pursue the principium individuationis. The artwork that appears as something universal bears the accidental quality of being an example of its genre. It is spuriously individual. Even Dada, the purely deictic gesture, was as universal as the demonstrative pronoun. That expressionism was more powerful as an idea than in its works perhaps has its origin in the fact that its utopia of the pure Greek word is itself a fragment of false consciousness. Yet the universal becomes substantial in artworks only by its self-transformation. Thus in Webern, the universal musical form of the development becomes a knot and renounces its developmental function. Its place is taken by a succession of segments of differing levels of intensity. As a result, the knot, like passages, becomes something wholly other, something more present and less relational than any development section ever was. Not only does the dialectic of the universal and particular descend into the depths of the universal in the midst of the particular, at the same time it destroys the invariance of the universal categories. All right, that's enough for today. See you later.